I've always wanted to be a musician, so I can kind of do a little Eric Clapton thing and just sit here, and I just can't play or sing. That's the bad part. All right, thank you very much for having me today. I'm going to give you a little background. The reason that I'm sharing with you today is that God had a unique and specific call on my wife and I's hearts probably about almost 7 or 8 years ago. And so I'm going to kind of detail that. But basically, the short end of the story, and I'm going to bring you the long-term version, is that we were called to move away from a white middle-class neighborhood into a different neighborhood. And I'll kind of talk about the diversity of the neighborhood and the things that have gone on. But that's part of the reason that I'm here. And so one thing that you're going to find out really quickly is that I'm not a professional. So I don't travel and speak, but I appreciate you having me here. And by not being a professional speaker, Mr. Ryan O'Connor brought up that you can ask questions. So please, if you want to stop me at any point, you can raise your hand. But I want to instruct you kind of on what kind of questions you can ask me. I'm going to start with that. And so because I'm not a professional, a lot of your questions can start with like this kind of a phrase, like, Barry, what in the world were you thinking when ... Like that would be a good way to start a question for me. Like what wouldn't be a good way to start a question would be like, how did you do this? Or how could I do this? Like I wouldn't know the answer to that part. So a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today are going to be failures, struggles that my wife and I both had, but also some great encouraging news to what this city looks like and how maybe you can plug in. So my background is I grew up in the car business. My dad was a car salesman for Terry Schulte. And so I grew up cleaning cars after school. I'd go and dump out garbage cans and wipe the floors for the shop, and so that's where I grew up in the car business. Every summer I ended up graduating, I don't know how, from Bethel College in St. Paul, and my wife and I got married when we were up there in our senior year. So I ended up selling cars up in Minneapolis, St. Paul, for a Chevy dealership up there, and then eventually moved to the Kia store here in Sioux Falls. And so I managed the Kia store for Billions for 6 years, moved over to the Toyota store after that, and managed that store for 7 years. So I have 2 kids. They're going to be my son turned 6 yesterday. And as I was leaving the house today, I told one of you this already. You looked at me and he said, Dad, what are you doing today? And I told him that I was going to be speaking to a group of people that were professionals and up-and-comers and cool people in Sioux Falls. And he looked at me and he said, Dad, you look like you're ready for the beach. So I am who I am. You get what you get. Sorry. That's what it is. So anyway, 2 kids. One just turned 6. One's about to turn 9. And I would love 3 more kids, but I have a wife that won't negotiate on that front at all. She's done, so that's how that works for me. Really, at the end of this time that we have together, I'm here to celebrate God's work in this world. I mean, that's the point of me here. So if you leave today thinking, oh man, God just really... if you leave here thinking, man, that guy's got a bunch of weird stories, and man, he's different, and you're thinking about Barry Termaat, then I've completely failed. So my goal as you leave here today is that you would see God's work here in Sioux Falls. You'd see God's work here in your own heart. So hopefully I'll leave you with that, okay? And so my goal is to have you see how God just used a regular family, not a professional, to hopefully continue to take steps in this world. So can I start with a word of prayer? We didn't pray. Let's bow our heads. Heavenly Father, I want to praise your name for this time. I thank you for this venue, for just our ability to freely talk about your work when you can think about the rest of the world and the many, many places that this can't happen, Lord. So I thank you for this. I thank you for the hour that you've given us. Lord, I ask that you would be shown as mighty in this time, that you would get all the praise and all the glory. And we thank you for your Son, Jesus Christ. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, so I'm going to start by sharing a couple true but really tragic stories, okay? And I've lived in my home now downtown. It's on First Avenue down here for about 3 years and 3 months. And so this was in the last 6 months. And the first story I'm going to talk about is a story about a self-made man that I got to meet. And I met him in the car business. And so this self-made man had his own mobile car washing business. And a couple of things struck me about this man when I first met him. Number one is he was always encouraged. He was always smiling, having fun, and looking for ways to grow his business. Now, that's not uncommon, but when you meet somebody for 10 years, and for 10 years straight, every time he comes and talks to you and asks you if he can wash your cars, you'd think that a couple of those days would be not quite as exciting, but not for him. And so that was the number one thing, is he was very enthusiastic and excited, always trying to look for new ways he could grow his business. Number two is I noticed about this man that he always had this desire, and his staff that washed the cars were kind of the down and out people. They're people that you and I would, probably categorize as down and out. Now, I had a couple of thoughts originally about that. Originally, I thought, man, he's probably hiring these people because these are people that probably would not demand quite as high of a wage, number one. And number two, these people would probably be willing to accept cash at the end of the day. So, although those two things were probably true about this man and his business, what I came to find out over the last 5 or 6 years is he actually had a passion for these people. He himself was an owner of the company, but at one time he was owned by alcohol. He was owned by alcohol, and so what his passion was is to drive around the city, and because of that he became a fixture in my new neighborhood, drive around the city and find people that were struggling with addiction, and hopefully he could use this job, this summer job mainly, but summer and spring and fall as well, to help encourage these people and get them out in the workforce. And so I got to learn about that passion over the last 3 or 4 years. And like I said, as a result, I saw him in our neighborhood with this shiny blue Ford truck every week. And some of my new friends in this neighborhood that my wife and I now have moved to were his friends for years and years. And they knew what he had gone through over his life. Well, one day, I want to say it was 5 or 6 months ago, I'm not great with dates, all of a sudden this man that I'd seen as enthusiastic and excited all the time, he met me in my backyard, and I saw that he was not doing well. That I heard about his business struggles. He had made a couple of poor decisions business-wise, and he had lost everything. He lost his house. He lost a lot of his friends that he thought were friends. I noticed, I looked out, and no longer did he have a shiny blue truck, Ford truck. He had an old, beat-up, rusty old truck that he could put his machinery in. And he just talked to me about what life was going on with him. He had lost even some girlfriends and things like that lately. And I genuinely, as I listened to him, I genuinely felt sick for this man. And in fact, I called a couple of my friends at Billions and said, hey, how can we rustle up some business for this guy? How can we help this guy out in his time of need? That day, I remember looking at him square in the face and saying, hey, I'm going to pray for you. And I know everything's going to work out, and God has a plan in all this. And he nodded and walked away. Well, 2 days later, a lot of my closest friends, the people that he employed, were crying in the backyard. And I found out that day that he made a bad decision to shoot his girlfriend several times and then ended up taking his own life. And so tragedy had struck our neighborhood. And I really had to deal with that and think about that. And I'm going to talk to you here shortly about some of the thoughts that went through my head and some of the decisions and hopefully the changes that I made because of it. But unfortunately, only a few weeks later, tragedy struck our neighborhood again. And so this is my second story. And as Jill and I moved in 3.5 years ago, Jill's my wife, we found out that this neighborhood was a very high turnover neighborhood that we lived in. A lot of rentals. So we'd meet people that we thought, oh man, these are going to be great relationships, and 3 weeks later they were gone, and it was no cell phones, their numbers didn't work, all kinds of things happened. Well, I met Jake during this time, early on when we moved into our house, and Jake, it was really clear early that he was a permanent fixture in the neighborhood. He owned his home. He was very proud of the neighborhood. We live in the All Saints district, and so he was proud, telling me, sharing the history of that neighborhood, proud of his own home. And so it was a really refreshing, cool thing to do, just talking with him. And so Jake and I we shared a love for Toyota SUVs. He had a nice 4Runner with cool wheels. And we shared a love of hunting dogs. And so he had a beautiful Brittany Spaniel and IPA beer. So for any of you that don't drink beer, I'm sorry, but I love IPA beer. So, and one day, a few months ago, all of a sudden all these police cars pulled up, and it was like some special unit, and all of a sudden the ambulances were pulling up, and they were all over our neighborhood. And so when that happens, it tends to be a common thing, but for some reason I had this pit in my stomach. And so my wife and I, we really hoped for the best, but we feared the worst. And I don't know exactly what happened that night, but I can tell you that a good man took his own life. I don't know the whole story. And so once again, our neighborhood was just in an area of just mourning and grief. And so I tell you these two stories not to just shock you and talk about how bad it can be in the neighborhood or whatever, but I just really think it's important to talk to each other about why lives matter and just what kind of situation is. I don't know about you, but for me, like a lot of times when I get into these relationships, I think I have all kinds of time. I get into a relationship and go, okay, God opened this door for me. Now it's time to build. And it could be 3, 4, 5 years down the road before we see any results. And I want you to think of that, because that's really, amidst the last 6 months, what's really helped change my heart and my mind in these situations. So I want you to think of these as well. Now, I don't know where each one of these men stood with their Maker, but both of these stories, for me, really point to the massive need for hope. Right? Can we all agree on that? And so it stirred my heart and my wife's heart as well. And so, like I said, we were praying for open doors. And I just want to read you verses out of Romans 10:14. Hopefully these are familiar. If they're not, hopefully they can become familiar to you. So Romans 10:14 says this, and this is in response to sharing what we have, which is, I'm going to assume, but probably it's not right, that a lot of us in this room have the gospel, right, in our hands and in our hearts. And so this is what the Scripture says about that. 10:14, how then will they call on him whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news, the gospel. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah said, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? So faith comes from hearing, and hearing is through the word of Christ. I want you to think about that, and I think it's really applicable when we think about our relationships, when we think about how much time we have here on earth with people that God's put in our way. I shared, one of our pastors shared with me a couple days ago that 200 million Americans are categorized as unchurched. 200 million categorized as unchurched. And if you keep that in mind, that means that we're the 4th largest unreached people group on planet Earth. A lot of you have heard about unreached people groups, but I never thought of the U.S. as that. And so I want to encourage you today. I want to get you excited and enthusiastic in your own neighborhoods about a possible thinking about maybe a change. I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to force you into anything. I can tell you that. God does that really well. All right, so I'm going to rewind a little bit and give you the story of God's call on my family and why, okay? So maybe some of you can relate to this. Probably none of you can. But I can tell you this to begin with is I was selling cars, and as soon as I got home, I rushed. Not just walked, rushed to shut my garage door. Okay? I had awesome neighbors. I know them really well actually now. I didn't when I lived there, but I would quickly get those down. I'd put the walls up in my castle, and hopefully no one would come to the door. No one would invite me over for a dinner or anything like that. That's how I functioned. And so part of the reason was time, and I just, we all think we're the busiest person in the world, right? I mean, what do people say? Whenever you say, hey, how's things going this summer? Everyone says what? I'm busy. All right, so every one of us in this room thinks we're the busiest person in the world. I've kind of realized that, and so I hate saying busy. Those are the things that people just expect to hear. I want to kind of bring up something that John Piper addresses in a book he wrote called What Jesus Demands for the World. And he's talking about referencing Jesus' words of loving your neighbor as yourself. And John Piper says this, and I think it's powerful. Jesus is not just saying, seek for your neighbor the same things you seek for yourself. Sorry, I lost my spot. I should probably quote this correctly. I can't just wing it on this one. Sorry, but also, okay, so one more time. Jesus is not just saying seek for your neighbor the same things you seek for yourself, but also seek them in the same way. The same zeal and energy and creativity and perseverance. He goes on to say this, measure your pursuit of the happiness of others by what it should be by the pursuit of your own. Measure your pursuit of the happiness of others by what it should be by the pursuit of your own. And for me, putting the walls up, not having dinner with my neighbors, not even wanting to exchange days and stories and things like that didn't really fit for that isolationist type theory. And as I start to read the Bible and Jesus' own words, it really didn't fit with his commands, how he lived his life and his actions. And so I came up with a great four excuses. So maybe you can relate to this. I'm probably going to ask you to raise your hand at the end if any of these excuses work for you. Because I don't want to be alone. Because I'm alone up here. And I'm kind of scared. Just kidding. All right. Number one excuse I said is God did not make me into a relational person. Now this is coming from a car salesman, keep in mind, all right? So I convinced myself that God did not make me into a relational person, and I told myself that. And number two, I said sharing my life and using my own home for hospitality are just not in my gifting. Okay, I convinced myself of that as well. Number three, missions are only accomplished by a select few called to foreign countries. I really believed that for a while. Even though, if you hold my feet to the carpet, I wouldn't have said that. I believed it. And then number four, it relates to number three. God only calls missionaries for specific relocation. Okay, and keep in mind what my thought of missionaries was. So I actually believe number four still stands. So anybody in this room, any of those things, can you relate to those? I'm not alone. I love that. Thank you. I feel part of a group today. I think I'm going to preach just a tad here. I'm not a preacher. Remember, I'm not a professional either, so you can take this for what you will. But I think what we've done in churches is done a great job of, has anybody in this room ever taken those giftings testings and found out, like, I'm talking about church spiritual gifts too, actually, okay? James actually gave me one, and I actually like him, okay? This is my former pastor, and when I say former, he left me, I didn't leave him, okay? Just so you know. All right, so I really think that those tests can do some great things to figure out where we should plug in the church. But what I've also found is those tend to compartmentalize us, all right? So all of a sudden you say, okay, well, you start saying things like, man, God really hasn't gifted me in this way. And you start to put yourself, and all of a sudden we become Christian specialists. Have you ever thought of that? We become Christian specialists. And for me, I'm going to say something really bold. I use this as an excuse to not do anything for Christ's work that put me out of my comfort zone, right? Every time something would take me out of my comfort zone, I'd say, oh man, that's really not in my gifting. Pastor James told me so. I'm kidding. He never told me that. Of course he didn't. All right? And so I think Satan uses this specialist mentality, and I think he does immobilize the gospel in our neighborhood, because guess what? When you bring the gospel to your neighborhood, do you have to just use your gifting? You have to use it all. I'm sorry. We have to be gifted in all kinds of areas. And so the second thing is I think it's extremely dangerous and sacrilegious to propose to know what God has for my life. Think about that. If God's just in a little box where we can tell, where He says, here's your spiritual gifting and this is what you're good at, hospitality or serving or this, that, the other, then that's us saying to God, hey, I know exactly what you have for a plan in my life. And in relation to the Bible, I want you to think about this. Is that how it worked with Moses? Did God use his giftings Was he a gifted leader and speaker? No, he complained about God constantly about how he stuttered and how he couldn't be the mouthpiece of God and how he couldn't lead these people out and how he was the wrong for everything. And so the more I read stories in the Bible, the more I think about Paul and this. And he had some of the giftings, but a lot of the patience stuff, the humility, all that. You think a zealot like that had a lot of humility? That's a gifting, folks, supposedly, right? This is who we are. This is who we are. And so my wife and I just started during this time in our this time in our life, we started a hunger after specific literature and videos. And so I'm going to just mention a few to you, and afterwards, if you want to say, hey, what was this about, or learn more about it, I can tell you. But Don't Waste Your Life was a big book in my life by John Piper. Radical by David Platt. Francis Chan had a big influence. A lot of his videos, Forgotten God, on my wife and I's head and hearts. Through Gates of Splendor, the story of Jim Elliot going down to the Aucas, written by his wife Elizabeth Elliot, big time. Dangerous Calling, When Helping Hurts. And any book. I just couldn't get enough of John Perkins. So if you haven't heard of Christian community development and his life, we can talk about that later. But number one, most importantly, it drove us to the Bible. So I'm going to quote another verse, Romans 12:16, and this really became the calling card for my wife and I, and really we started to dig into it and think about it. And so Romans 12:16 says this: live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. What I want you to think about today is the questions that I asked myself, and those words just struck me. I mean, sometimes, you guys know, certain verses you can hear over and over again, they just fly right over your head, and then certain verses, all of a sudden, they strike you, right? And that's God, and that's His Spirit's work. And so the question I asked myself is, Barry, who in my life and who in your life, I want to ask you this today, would you consider to be lowly? Who in your life? And when I talk about who in your life, the next thing that should come to mind is what the verse says. It says, but associate with the lowly. And so I want you to think really hard, because this is what I had to think about. What do you think God is telling me when He uses the word associate? Right? Is it just like going down to the mission and serving a meal? Is that associating? Associating means you have them as an associate, right? And so I think it just could be a lot more than that. And so, the second part of this verse, I'm going to read it one more time. Never be wise in your own sight. I think it's very easy for us to appear wise in our own sight when we have a certain upbringing. I mean, I'm looking around this room right now, and I'm not seeing a lot of color and diversity. I got one guy here, and he's a friend of mine, all right? I love it, okay? And that's not a bad thing at all, guys, but I mean, think about yourself. I think you can relate to this. If you have a certain upbringing, a certain education, opportunities to succeed, upward mobility, the right color skin, right? It's a lot different it's very easy for us to appear wise, like, hey, man, we made this. We're self-made. We've done this ourselves. Versus, now that I've lived where I've lived and seen such a diversity, and I've lived next to people that I think in Sioux Falls that the Bible would consider to categorize them as lowly, you see the opposite. You start to see cyclical family problems. No hope. Lack of education. We've read a lot about it in the news the last few weeks. Wrong color skin. I mean, those things are real, and it's totally different. And so, through all this searching, through the Bible, through these different books, my wife and I knew that here on earth we were not home, but also even physically in Sioux Falls we weren't home. And so we started to really dig in and figure about what we should do next. I'm going to make sure I'm on schedule. I'm doing okay, I think. Any questions while I have a drink?
Could you elaborate, just kind of curious on just how do we find the lowly? How do we go out and just find opportunities? We're probably not all ready to move.
Yeah.
But how else can we? What are some other ways where you've experienced opportunities to reach out to people?
Yeah, and this is a great point that Ryan makes. I'm not going to just sit here and tell my story. Like I said, I want to leave you with real concrete examples. So I think we'll get to that. I'm going to argue this whole time that it's done through relationship and that it needs to be consistent. Okay, so if you're not ready to say, hey, even once every 2 weeks I can do this for half an hour, then I would just encourage you not to do these kinds of things. So I'll have real concrete examples. That's what we're going to finish with. So just so you know, this is actually going to get to the application stage. So for some of you that don't like storytelling, it's coming, I promise. The real nuts and bolts. But then the bad part about that is you actually have to do something. So it might just be easier to sit back and listen to my stories, just so you know. But I'm going to argue that it's going to be relationship. And so we're going to dig into that, okay, in just a second. Great question. I'm not going to ask you any more questions. I have you guys ask any more questions because I don't know what you're going to say. So, all right, I'm kidding. All right, so our household, we started on our house hunt, okay? So we live in a middle-class white neighborhood. Great place to live, guys. I don't want this to be about how you can't live where you live, okay? This was a specific calling on our life. And so I don't want to come across. In fact, if my neighbors are sitting in here, I want them to know I love that neighborhood. It was a me problem. Okay? And I really feel like it took me to take a specific jump that I saw as scary and dangerous in order to change my heart. And that's what God took and pushed me towards to do that. So I want to make that very clear. But at this time, Jill sought our specific calling, and we looked and we thought we were called to a specific neighborhood. And so we actually found a house on First Avenue, probably about 10 houses down from, 20 houses down from where we live right now. Okay, we live right by the tattoo parlor on First Avenue, between 14th and if there was a 16th, that's where it would be. Okay, so that's where we live right now. And so this was probably 20 houses towards McKenna Park from there. And we looked at the house. The house had been on the market for 363 days, so almost a year. I remember thinking, man, this thing's been on the market for a year. Guess what? I'm a car guy. I can smell a deal. Here we go. All right? All of a sudden. And so we look at it. The thing didn't look like it needed a lot. It had been updated. A lot of those old homes still, nothing had been updated. This thing had forced air and heat everywhere, and it looked like it was going to be a big house, a great place to entertain in. That was the things. It had a small front porch, so that was one of my wife and I's things. We were like, hey, let's have a front porch. We could imagine this calling and could imagine our neighbors hanging out up on the front porch. And so it had one. It was quite small. So we went through and we said to our realtor, man, this looks like the right one. Well, 2 hours later, we find out the house sold. All right, so right away we're like, oh, okay, not a problem. So here's what we're doing. Every Sunday, every extra time we have off, she and I are separately and together going through neighborhoods in Sioux Falls. And I'm going to tell you, there's certain neighborhoods in Sioux Falls that we stopped at and we just said, I don't think we can do it. And guys, this isn't Detroit. This isn't downtown Atlanta. We all know this. But what I'm going to tell you and show you with these stories is that our Sioux Falls probably isn't quite as clean and nice as we think it is either, right? So it's kind of somewhere in between. But I can tell you that I was fearful in some areas. I was thinking about my little kids. I was thinking about the fact that I leave town for a week a lot of times and have my wife and 2 little kids there, okay? And so there were some neighborhoods that it just didn't feel right. We were like, oof, not sure I can do this, okay? But we're going all over the place. So the next house we found, totally different neighborhood. We thought, let's take a look at it. We set up, this house had been on the market for 167 days. And I don't know why I remember these numbers. I remember almost nothing. So most of you guys that know me in here know I got a terrible memory. But I remember that in 167 days. So I thought, okay, perfect. Let's go look at it. We set up the meeting to go look at it. The house sold that day. It did. And then another house, same thing, sold before we could even look at it. So we had now 3 houses that sold before we could even look at them, or when we look at them, we couldn't even put an offer in. They had sold. And these, the market, this would have been over 4 years ago, wasn't as hot as it is right now. So this was very uncommon. I'm just thinking, man, God, are you not calling me to move now all of a sudden? Like all these closed doors were coming fast. But what God was teaching me is my microwave mentality, right? The second we decide, hey, this is a clear call from God, then what do we want to happen? We want it right now, right? I wanted to be in that house. I could have looked at a house in an hour and just bought it. And you'll find out I eventually did. But so after a couple months of just going neighborhood to neighborhood and doing this, my wife and I would take separate trips after our work, like I said, and she'd go someplace and just look at it, and I would. And one night we both came home, and I said to her, it was one of those deals like in the movies where they go, hey, I got great news. You go first, I go first, whatever. So I let her go first, and she said, hey, I think I found the home that we're going to want to live at. It's for sale. It's right on First Avenue. It's got a huge front porch. The weeds are over our heads, but we can work on weeds. We're not construction people, but we can cut weeds. We can do rock work and all this stuff. And I said, perfect. I said, here's the great news for you is I think it's the same house. Is it 718 South 1st? And she said, yeah. I said, I went by that same house tonight. All right? Praise the Lord, right? All of a sudden, we've got this, whew, and all of a sudden, we just felt great about it, and we knew it. So we called the realtor that was listed. There was a sign out front, and guess what the realtor told us? Hadn't sold. The guy rented it. 12-month rental. That day. Ugh. We were really having to learn patience. And this was so good for my wife and I that we could learn about this patience. And so we prayed about it and just left it. And so for another 2 to 3 months, we had nothing. No house. We kept thinking about that yellow house on South First. And we kept just wishing and hoping. But we were just like, you know what? Maybe that God's timing, we know it's perfect, but it's not our timing. And we tried to pray that prayer. But deep down, we knew it was time to move. And one day, I drove by again at the end of work day, and I saw a moving truck out front. And so I immediately called the realtor who had listed that house, and he said, you know what, it's not for sale anymore, but I'll at least call the guy that owns the house. And so he called the guy, and I ended up getting on the horn with him a little bit later too, and I found out that this gentleman that owned this home on South First Avenue was either going to lose it because he was going down the tubes with his mortgage, or he was going to have to rent it or sell it. And so there was a specific dollar amount he had to have. It seemed to fit right within what I was thinking. And so we went through the house on a 98-degree day, and there's window air conditioners, and none of them worked. And I just remember just sweating. And it's got 3 layers, so it's got a main level, and then a second level with all the bedrooms, and then this third level that had 1970s green carpet in it, and it had all this stuff hanging from the probably asbestos. Hopefully there's no guys that sign off on this stuff, but anyway, I don't know what I'm trying to say. But anyway, we went up there and we were just sweating bullets, and Jill and I said, hey, this is it. This is the house. We hadn't seen the inside of the house ever before. We saw it for a half an hour, and we agreed to terms, and one day we owned this home. So this was the home that we both had landed on 3 months earlier. This is the home that we had prayed about. We felt great about the neighborhood. We had hung around that neighborhood. Like, I don't know what people thought of us. We'd just park on the side of the neighborhood for hours and pray about things, but I'm sure somebody thought they had a stalker in a Toyota out there for sure. And so, one other quick story, I got to tell it. How are we doing for time? Anybody shout it out? 12:36. All right. I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to get going quicker to the meat and potatoes, but you got to know this. This is an awesome story. So our current house that we lived, right, on the east side of town, in a suburb or whatever you call it, we put it up for sale, and the day before we were going to put it on the market, we got water in our basement. We'd never, ever had water in our basement. It went through a window or something, like maybe I hadn't shut it all the way, is what I'm guessing. But all of a sudden, we had all this water, so we just pulled it up and had the huge fans going, and I had a buddy of mine that took care of it, Bob's Carpet Cleaning. If anybody needs a carpet cleaner, he's a good man. Anyway, he helped get that cleared out, but it was still getting dry, and we decided to put the thing on the market. Now, this is not a good decision from someone who knows how to sell things, but I decided to do it anyway. Okay. The other thing I decided is we're going to raise the house $30,000 from what our realtor really thought we should list it for. And I just had it. I told him I had a great feeling. Okay, and so we listed it, and this is the awesome part of the story, is the next day we put it on the market. So as its carpet's getting drying out, so I'm not hiding anything, right? Because I got to tell these people about it anyway. They might as well see it. That day, we get a call and say, hey, there's a full offer on your house. But that's not the cool part of the story. It was. I mean, it worked out good. But the cool part is this family, this couple, had actually, the realtor that they were with had taken a wrong turn, and so they had this brochure of a totally different house in their hands. And when they walked in, they just saw the sign in the front yard, walked in, right? Had one of those key boxes that all the realtors can get in. They walk in, and they're like trying to compare it, and they're like, why in the world wouldn't they have listed this on their brochure, and this and that and the other? So they didn't even know how much my house was, right? And so they ended up loving it so much and going through the whole house and loving it. Eventually they figured out it wasn't the house they were supposed to be at, and they bought it that day. One day on the market. Praise the Lord. Clap for the Lord right now. That's a big deal, right? That's a big deal, guys. so all of a sudden, I'm coming into this new house, and we're worried about it. Trust me, I can tell you that to begin with, we've got family members, friends, co-workers are like, what are you doing? They're trying to get me handgun certified so I can have a conceal and carry weapon permit, and all this stuff is being talked about. But think about this. We get all these confirmations time and time and time again. How can I not go into my neighborhood with just a ton of confidence, a ton of enthusiasm, knowing that the creator of the universe has got my protection, because this is where he has ordained me to be. I mean, that was so powerful for me and my family as we went into it, okay? And so we moved into a neighborhood that didn't value the things of our own neighborhood. I can tell you that we shared stuff a lot more, and I didn't really want to do this, but my power tools got shared. But all of a sudden, I needed a lot more tools as I was fixing up this old 1908 house. And I'm no good at anything, so not only did I need my neighbors' tools, I needed all their expertise. And so a 9-month renovation, I ended up employing lots and lots of my neighbors. And so that was just a beautiful time. Things were shared. Power tools were shared. Like I said, meals were shared together often. And my wife and I's soul and our family's soul was being refreshed, surrounded by diversity of thought, background, and cultures, and economy. I'll tell you that. And although that comes with a completely different set of problems, what we found is having it together, just the perception of having everything together in life, that was no longer valued in my neighborhood. It was okay to have a bad run in life. I mean, in fact, if you acted like you had everything together, no one would trust you. And that's still the case right now, okay? And so I learned that we mourn losses for more than 10 minutes. You know what I mean? And there's more to it than just, and I'm not throwing stones at this, but just dropping off a meal or whatever. There's just more to it. And so the other thing that I got is a 24-hour, 365 days a week guard of protection around our house from God, but through my neighbors. And so a lot of them, thankfully, are unemployed. It's great, guys. I mean, they're sitting on the back deck having those huge camo beers, and they are watching my back door. Nobody's getting in there. All right? These are the people that, I was sharing with Ryan the other day. I mean, and I'm not here to toot my own horn, but how many filet mignons do you think this guy that grew up on the south side of Chicago with 14 brothers and sisters ever had in his life? You know, he's getting them, and we're having fun with it, and it's a good time. So as a result, I'm going to go quickly here, guys. I know we're running out of time. I stepped away from selling cars in order to have more time for my neighborhood. And guys, this hasn't gone great. I mean, I've got a great story here of how God called us into this, but I promise you there are a lot of times where I just want to put those walls back up, where I just want to say, hey, you know what, I can't deal with some of the drunkenness. I don't want to deal with the fact that my neighbors are probably selling meth because I don't know why. From 1 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock in the morning, there's constant, or 6 o'clock, you know what I'm saying, 1 o'clock in the morning to 6 in the morning, there's traffic constantly, and then I don't see them for days. I don't know how. They don't have jobs. I don't know how it works. And so there's times where I just don't want to deal with that. I really don't. But I can tell you that Bible studies have started to fail, or started and failed. And so I don't have perfect conversion stories for you today. Hopefully in like 2 or 3 years, we can come back to the same venue. You'll be invited, and I can talk about all the things God's doing. But I can tell you that the gospel is being laid out. And I can tell you that conversations are being had. I've prayed with more people at midnight, just weeping people, than I could have ever imagined I'd have in my whole life. I promise you that happens. But it hasn't led to conversion. I don't have these great stories. One of the biggest benefits that my wife and I have learned from this is through our own kids. Okay? Remember, I've got kids that just turned 6, about to turn 9. My youngest is a boy, oldest is a girl, and so of course, you can imagine how in a diverse neighborhood of economy, you have families that have virtually nothing. I mean, really, I was surprised at how little families actually have. And so we had the benefit, of course, of having our kids learn to share. And so that's an easy benefit. I mean, your kids can learn that at daycare. So this isn't, you don't have to move downtown in order to do this, just so you know. But the example I want to share with you is my daughter Ella. She had a friend, and that day, her friend Sophia, and Sophia just lived in the neighborhood for about 2 months. So we just had this little bit of time. And Sophia was having a birthday, and my daughter said, "Oh, are you having a cake? And when are you going to open presents and all this?" And Sophia looked at her and just, "My birthday is just any other day. It's just like any other day. There's nothing that I have." And it just broke my daughter's heart. And so she ran upstairs to that third level with the green carpet and cooking hot, and she opened up her drawer, and she's got like, I hope, can I get a raise of hands for this too? Does any one of your daughters have like 30 Barbies or more? Please? There's 2 people. Great. I'm getting a smaller group. So I got problems. You guys know I got problems. I buy stuff for my kids like crazy. I want to. But here's the great thing about all this is my daughter looked at 30 Barbies, and there was one in a package. One in a package, and it was the Christmas, I don't know if we know Barbies here, I don't, but it was like this Christmas one with this huge gown, and it's a limited edition, and they try to sell you on the fact that they only make 100 so they can charge you 250. I don't know what it was. She got it from her grandpa, so it's got to be nice. She pulled that out, and my wife wanted to stop her so bad and just say, "Hey, you got 30 other Barbies. This gal won't care which one you give her." And Ella wanted to give her the unwrapped, the unopened package of the most beautiful limited edition doll. And so praise the Lord that she got to do that. And it's just, I've seen ministry in my kids over and over and over, and the conversations at the dinner table are totally different than anything I would have ever had, I promise you. We're talking about challenges of neighbors with food. That happens. I know it shouldn't. I know we got lots of things in town they can walk to or go to, but sometimes these people just don't want to do that. They don't want you and me to serve them every single day. I mean, think of how that feels. And I'm not trying to throw stones at those. We need those things. But I'm just telling you, there's challenges with food in this city. There's challenges with clothing. Okay? Even though we get it out there, the Ransom Church is doing a great job, if you belong there, of trying to get clothing out to the right people, and it's difficult, but these folks don't have smartphones where they get the text that this is going on. I'm just saying, their number changes all the time. There's problems with transportation. A lot of one-parent homes, which I know we have even here, but one-parent homes that come also from a very low education level, okay? And you guys know all these things. And so the good things that are happening with our kids and the neighbors are basketball games that are happening at our house. We got the basketball court for the neighborhood. We got a big thing of balls that stay out winter, summer, spring, fall, all the time, okay? We got grill outs, bag throwing contests. I mean, I'm a winner when it comes to bags. All right, sorry. I think as I think about it right now, as I was writing this, I do think our family is accepted in this neighborhood, but we still stick out. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I got 3 Toyotas in the garage. We're pulling up with stuff that nobody in the neighborhood has. But you know what's beautiful about having that diversity of economy is it always lends in the neighborhood and in a group like this. It lends to people looking at me and saying, "Hey, Barry, why?" Right? And the second that somebody in the neighborhood says why, what can that necessarily lead into? A story about God and His good work. And the story of God in my heart. And the great thing that I'm learning week in, week out, my wife's learning week in and week out, is we're a lot more alike than we are different. And I'll say that over and over and over again. My neighbor that doesn't have a job, that's living on disability, and he shouldn't be, is a lot more like me than we are different. That's what I'm learning. Okay? And so that diversity has been great. And that question of why, whether it comes from a coworker or someone in my neighborhood, always can point to a conversation about God. Praise the Lord for that. All right, guys. Sorry. How much time do we got?
10 more minutes.
All right, I'm going to take 5 minutes to give you a call to action. I talked to you about concrete things. We're going to talk about that right now. Call to action, 4 things in just a second. After that 5 minutes is up, we're going to have 5 minutes for questions, and anybody else can hang around. But remember how those questions have to be phrased. What were you thinking when you did this, Barry? Okay? All right, number 1, I want to encourage you to see new and old relationships that God's places and has placed in your life as ticking time bombs. Okay, you know my first 2 stories, so that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking now, hopefully, God willing, that I'm going to think of conversations as, man, this could be the last time I talk to this person. What does that conversation need to sound like? What does that conversation, what does God will for that conversation? And that's not a guilt trip, guys, right? You don't have to feel guilty. I don't feel guilty about that, but I know that things happen for a reason, and so this is what I'm learning. So number 2, I believe that you should take risks with your family and focus on God's promises to guide and protect you. It's changed my life. You can hear it. I hope you hear it. Okay? Number 3, relocation's not required for everyone, but if you're a believer, being on mission is. I'm going to say that one more time. Relocation's not for everybody, but if you're a believer, being on mission constantly is. Okay? As head of my spiritual house, I do believe, and I said this already, that God really needed me to get uncomfortable. He pushed me to be uncomfortable in order to change my heart and my mind for how I viewed the city and how I viewed my mission. It works, I promise. Number 4, these are the practical steps. Dip your toe in the water. I said this already. I want you to emblazon this on your mind because it's what I believe. Relationship changes things and consistency changes things. So if you're going to get involved in something, I just ask that you be consistent. Okay? And when you set up to be on something, tell them, hey, I'm in this for 2 years. And tell the people that you're going to be in relationship the amount of time you're going to be in. But then you got to stick to it. Okay? Think about a kid that needs a dad in their life, all right? Does he need a man to speak into his life for 2 weeks or 3 weeks and he thinks this is going to be his relationship through high school and then you walk away? How are you any different? Okay? So be consistent and then just tell the people up front, this is what I can commit to and this is what I'm willing to do. Does that make sense to everybody? A couple of examples. Bethany Christian Services. I see some people out here that have been part of that organization. They have a thing called Safe Families. You can take kids, you can be on a list to take kids that for either 2 weeks or sometimes 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 months. Sometimes, not usually. It's not meant to be that. But we had a situation, my wife and I, where we were blessed to have kids for 7 months, and it was incredible. But normally it's just a short window of time where you can pour into the lives of these kids. Somebody else is dealing with the family, and you can take a risk by having a new child in your house for a short time. Down the street, Compassion Child Care. It's an organization that I'm part of. It works with families that need help with daycare costs while they go to work. And what they need down there is book readers, child rockers, Bible teachers. We're teaching the Word of God right there. It's a privately funded organization right down the road. It's in the Sioux Falls Ministry Center across the street from the post office. Center of Hope's in that same building. I can promise you that you spend any time at Center of Hope and you will be around a population in Sioux Falls that is largely ignored. I promise you. Okay, so if you want to get with the people in Sioux Falls that the Bible categorizes as lowly, it's a great place to start. And they'll tell you. You just be consistent. Number 4, Crew City's got an event coming up. And I'm going to have Dave speak to this in just a second. But it's called Rock the Block. Okay, and then it's at the Bowdoin Youth Center. He's going to tell you more about it, but it's a real way that you can get neighbors, people downtown, people that you normally don't rub shoulders with. You can become involved with those people. So I want you to finish with this and think about this, is as you associate with the lowly in Sioux Falls, the lowly, and it's underprivileged, at risk. There's all kinds of politically correct words, but you guess what, guys? The Bible uses the term lowly, so I'm going to use the term lowly. As you associate with the lowly in Sioux Falls, you will gradually become less wise in your own sight, I promise you, and you will experience heart change due to the grace of God. So thank you for your time. I'm going to save this time for questions and things like that, but I really appreciate you listening today.